Join our community by subscribing. Every click helps us share more stories like this one.
The introduction. It was a humid August evening in 1994, when the small town of Sycamore Creek was shaken by a crime that would haunt its residents for decades. Behind the respectable facade of a quaint suburban neighborhood, a sinister undercurrent Poseidon of unsettling secrets and buried truths. The sleepy streets that typically echoed with the laughter of children and the chatter of neighbors grew silent as dust painted the sky a deep indigo hue. The phone rang in the Wilkins household shortly after 10 p.m., breaking through the tranquil atmosphere. Julia Wilkins, a devoted mother of two, swept her short auburn hair behind her ear. She felt a knot of unease tighten in her gut as she picked up the receiver. There was something about the voice on the line, assertive yet low, even intimate, that sent chills coursing down her spine. "You need to get your children out of the house," the voice instructed, as Julia's mind raced with confusion. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Panic erupted inside her as she methodically turned towards the hallway. The living room was dark, the shadows creeping down the walls like a predatory animal poised to pounce. Julia's instincts kicked in. She needed to protect her children. Dashing to the room where Jill and Ben were sleeping, she shook them awake, her voice frantic yet hushed. "You need to come with me," she urged, her heart racing. The faint sound of creaking floorboards behind her made her stomach drop as she hurried her children toward the back door. The weight of the night pressed heavily upon her, a grim sense that this was no ordinary call, and that their lives were about to change forever. The victim. The following morning, the sun rose sluggishly over Sycamore Creek, casting a golden hue over the sleepy town that had spent the night shrouded in fear. The sound of chirping birds was a stark contrast to the unsettling whispers that spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. News of Julia Wilkins' mysterious phone call had stirred a collective anxiety among the residents. Yet, amid the growing tension, the focus soon shifted to the Wilkins home itself, where a dark cloud loomed just outside its walls. The police had arrived early, drawn to the house of a seemingly ordinary family, marked by an extraordinary incident. Investigators combed through the property like detectives in a noir film, searching for clues while keeping gathered crowd at bay. As they entered the master bedroom, however, fruitless hopes shattered. There, draped across the bed, was the unmistakable form of Keith Wilkins, Julia's husband, a victim of a violent crime that sent ripples of disbelief across the tight-knit community. Keith, a local schoolteacher known for his passionate dedication, had always been the kind of man who lit up any room he entered. No one could have guessed he would become the focus of such darkness. His gentle demeanor and easy smile had made him a favorite with students and parents alike. But that morning, as the coroner gently moved aside the white sheets to confirm death, Keith's lifeless body told another story, a tale of struggle and desperation. Bruises marred his neck, and blood trailed from a gash on his temple, revealing a violent end to a life that had promised so much. The trauma was evident, not only on his body but in the expressions of the investigators, documenting the grim scene. They stood transfixed for a moment, piecing together the puzzle in their minds. If this was a home invasion, why had Julia received that cryptic warning? And why had Keith been the one caught in the crossfire? With each detail gathered An even darker narrative began to unfold, suggesting that life in Sycamore Creek might be far more complex than anyone dared to believe. Crime scene. The room held its breath as Detective Laura Marsh stepped inside, her years of experience sharpening her instincts. A general unease enveloped her, binding the atmosphere into an almost palpable sense of dread. She had been on the force long enough to recognize when something didn't fit, and everything about this scene felt disjointed. As her eyes adjusted to the low light, every detail came alive. An overturned chair, a broken lamp with shards scattered across the hardwood floor, and a faint smell of blood that lingered like a ghost of violence. The juxtaposition between the normalcy of a family's bedroom and the chaos wrought by tragedy was striking. Laura knelt beside the bed, her gloved hands carefully lifting the sheet to expose Keith's lifeless form. It was not just the brutality of the crime that struck her. It was the visceral reminder that they were about to uncover the events that had led to his untimely demise. The forensic team moved methodically around the room, documenting with precision. They snapped photographs of every angle, every blemish playing a part in the grim story, unfolding within these four walls. A small smudge of blood against the bedside table's leg piqued Laura's interest. She could almost imagine the struggle that had taken place. The moment fear had morphed into desperation. Was this struggle part of a larger plan or a spontaneous act of violence? Laura focused on the bedroom's windows. They were locked tight, save for a slight crack where a screen was ripped. Hanging precariously on one corner, a sigh escaped her lips as she considered the implications. If this was a break-in, the perpetrator had likely planned their entry with care, yet the urgency implied by Keith's death hinted at something far more personal, a confrontation that spiraled out of control. Stepping back momentarily, Laura couldn't shake a troubling thought. Was no mere. This crime felt intimate, perhaps even targeted. As the team continued to collect evidence, Laura found herself haunted by the chilling knowledge that in this house, the seekers were not just hidden behind locked doors, but coursed through the veins of the tightly knit community itself. The early investigation. With the scene tightly secured, Detective Laura Marsh convened a meeting with her partner, Detective Brian Kellogg, in the police precinct just a few blocks away from the Wilkins home. The stark white walls and buzzing fluorescent lights of the station bore witness to countless tragic narratives. But today felt particularly heavy. The weight of the Wilkins family's uncertainty pressed down on them, demanding swift action and concrete answers. Something doesn't add up, Brian murmured, leaning back in his chair as he flicked through the notes gathered from the crime scene. If this was a botched home invasion, why was Keith the only one here? Julia received a warning but didn't mention anything unusual leading up to this. Laura nodded, setting her jaw. The lack of forced entry also suggests that this wasn't just a random act. It points to someone who had knowledge of the familiar person feeling comfortable enough to breach their sanctuary. She grabbed a marker and began sketching the house's exterior on a notepad, diagramming the flow of entry points and potential escape routes. They spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing neighbors and family friends, hopeful that the Wilkins network would yield some insights. Susan, one of Julia's closest friends, described her as vivacious yet reclusive. Julia hardly ever discussed her marital troubles, she said, biting her lip, but I sensed something was off recently. It didn't sit well with Laura. Why hadn't Julia confided if there were issues? As evening fell, their investigation brought them to a chilling discovery. An old acquaintance of Keith's, someone he had recently argued with over a business deal gone sour, had resurfaced in town. A shadow had been cast over their connection, and it wasn't long before Brian brought it to Laura's attention. We need to find out if there's any validity to this tension, he suggested. That night, they left the precinct with a renewed purpose. The sun, bruised and bleeding its final colors, slipped behind the horizon as they drove toward the apartment of a man named Todd Marston. Laura felt a tingling anticipation mixed with trepidation. They were venturing deeper into the unknown, where one revelation could set off a string of consequences tied to this horrible crime. The town of Sycamore Creek, it seemed, was not as innocent as it appeared. The dead ends, the early morning sun, bathed Sycamore Creek in a soft golden light. But the warmth failed to penetrate the chill that clung to Laura and Brian's resolve. Arriving at Todd Marston's apartment, they were greeted by a facade of normalcy, a neat lawn, and a well-maintained porch. Yet inside, the atmosphere felt heavier, charged with tensions best left unspoken. Todd, a man in his late 30s, stood tall with broad shoulders, eyes darting with uncertainty. The moment they introduced themselves, his demeanor shifted from cordial to defensive. "I didn't do anything wrong," he stammered, hands fidgeting at his sides. As they pressed for details about his last interactions with Keith, a palpable unease thickened between them, like static before a summer storm. "Bide were on an edware. Obi, Hero. Niao now or Irao Gandhi. I can't believe he's dead," Todd said, his voice carrying a hint of regret, but his nervousness spoke louder. "We had a disagreement, but that's all it was. Just business." Suspicion flared in Laura's mind. This was no ordinary disagreement. The biting tone implied deeper discord, that he was desperate to mask. She probed further, but Todd deftly sidestepped every question, shifting the conversation toward his career and how difficult it had been since moving back. The meeting ended without concrete evidence. Todd's alibi checked out. There was nothing tangible to hold him accountable. Disappointment hung in the air like an ominous fog as Laura and Brian left his apartment, their hopes for a solid lead dashed against the walls of meaningless banter. Days turned into weeks. The investigation seemed to stagnate, stretching into a series of dead ends. As the town reeled from the aftermath of Keith's murder, Laura and Brian watched the community landscape transform. Residents whispered about the tragedy, knitting rumors into the fabric of their daily lives. Questions flooded conversations, but tangible progress eluded them. Even the smallest details fell flat. A waitress claimed to overhear a cryptic conversation between two men at the diner, but it led nowhere. The morning jogger reported seeing a man loitering near the Wilkins house on the night of the murder, yet the sketch that emerged from the description felt incomplete. An outline without defining features. Frustration clawed at Laura as she pored over the myriad notes littered across her desk. With each passing day, the sense of urgency weighed heavy. They needed a breakthrough, something, anything, that could reignite the flame of a once promising investigation. But as they pieced together the fragments of Keith Wilkins' life, it became clear that the trapdoor into the darkness of Sycamore Creek might never fully reveal itself. A break in the case. It was an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon when a call from a local pawn shop broke the silence that had enshrouded Laura and Brian's investigation. The shop owner, a wiry man with a penchant for tattoos, reported a recent transaction that piqued his interest. A gold watch inscribed with the initials KW. The watch had belonged to Keith Wilkins. Amidst the emotional turmoil that enveloped the Wilkins family, Laura's heart raced as they arrived at the pawn shop, a familiar scent of stale coffee and metal filling the air. She approached the counter where the shop owner Dan was displaying the watch, its surface glinting under the fluorescent lights. "I had a regular come in just a few days after the murder," Dan explained, his voice gritty yet eager. He seemed anxious to get rid of it. "But I remember him well enough to know he didn't own anything like this before." Brian took his turn examining the item, noticing how the engraved initials appeared worn, evidence of a recent struggle. "Did you get a name?" he asked, his attention already turning toward potential suspect. "Yeah," he said. "His name was Greg. Kind of a sketchy guy, you know. I seen him hanging around, but wasn't sure if he was trouble." Dan's eyes darted nervous. "He paid cash, which is something I always check for. You never know when someone's trying to offload something nefarious." With the watch secured as evidence, Laura and Brian left the pawn shop with renewed vigor. That evening, they canvassed the streets again, questioning anyone familiar with a man named Greg. Local shopkeepers and bar owners offered varying accounts. An unreliable man with a reputation for petty theft and bar fights, but more importantly, they discovered that Greg had a connection to Todd Marston, their previous suspect. The threads began to intertwine as they dug deeper. With each conversation, it became apparent that Greg frequented the same bars where Todd often drank. The two had fallen into a circle that discussed investment disputes, rumors of betrayal that might explain Todd's animosity toward Keith. Fueled by their newfound lead, Laura and Brian plotted their next move. They would locate Greg, flush him from the shadows where he'd been lurking, and unravel the tangled web of harassment and theft. The pale moon hung overhead as they drove through Sycamore Creek with a fresh sense of purpose. The town's uneasy silence, now underscored by the promise of justice, just out of reach. After months of stasis, they had a name, a whisper of truth that could lead them closer to solving the murder of Keith Wilkins. The suspect. The neon lights of Rick's Tavern bathed the streets in a garish glow, transforming the small establishment into a hive of activity on a crisp fall evening. Laura and Brian stepped inside, the low murmur of conversations punctuated by laughter and the clinking of glasses. The air was thick with the scent of fried food and spilled beer, but their focus lay elsewhere. At a back table, nursing a drink with an uneasy expression, sat Greg. "Let's approach casually," Laura suggested, feeling the tension in her gut coiling tighter. They weaved through the crowd, men and women, oblivious to the unfolding drama. As they reached Greg, Laura set her hands on the table, her presence unyielding. "Greg, right? Can we have a word?" He looked up, eyes narrowing as if sizing them up. "What's this about?" he stammered, his bravado flicker. "We're investigating the murder of Keith Wilkins," Brian interjected, watching Greg closely for any signs of guilt. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about that gold watch you sold at the pawn shop." Greg's pallor shifted as fear mingled with confusion on his features. "You don't know anything about that," he muttered, voice cracking slightly. But Laura noticed his fingers twitching, betraying his facade. "Interesting how you showed up with that watch so soon after he died," Laura pressed. "Care to explain?" For a moment, he remained silent, beads of sweat collecting on his brow. Then he let out a nervous laugh. "You got it all wrong. I didn't kill anyone. I didn't even know the guy. Brian leaned forward, challenging him with intensity. You knew Todd, didn't you? You two ran in the same circles. Fights over business and broken promises. Was Keith just collateral damage in that mess? As Greg's confident facade cracked, the shift in his demeanor was palpable. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, replaced by an air of desperation. It was a stupid argument. I sold him some bad investments and Todd just got crazy about it. But I didn't hurt Keith. I was just trying to get rid of it, and trying to get rid of what? Laura cut him off. The watch? Or something up. Greg's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. The weight of scrutiny becoming unbearable. I thought I was helping Todd out. He didn't want anyone to know. His voice lowered to a whisper. He was scared of what Keith might do. What did you mean? Brian pressed on, capitalizing on the shift in Greg's tone. Todd said something about wanting to confront him about the money. He was worried Keith would go after him. I swear I didn't think he would actually... The pieces suddenly began to click into place. Behind the trappings of petty theft and bar fights lay a tangled story of jealousy and betrayal. Intertwined with their lives were signposts that might lead to something bigger. Where can we find Todd? Where can we find Todd? Laura demanded, sensing they were on the verge of a breakthrough. The suspect wobbly on his heels as the walls of deceit began to close in. Greg hesitated, sweat trickling down his face. Laura understood that they were gaining ground. Everything hinged on Todd Marston now, and exposing his connection to Keith's death was closer than they ever imagined. The trial, months of painstaking investigation, culminated in a courtroom, draped in an atmosphere thick with tension. The once peaceful town of Sycamore Creek crowded into the courthouse, the air replening with gossip and anticipation. People exchanged guarded glances as they settled into the wooden pews, the shadow of Keith Wilkins' murder looming over them like a dark cloud. Today they would witness justice, or lack thereof, unfolding before their eyes. Detective Laura Marsh sat in the front row, her heart heavy as she absorbed the details of the trial. Todd Marston, now a defendant, appeared more haggard than she remembered, the weight of his alleged actions etched deep into his features. The prosecution argued a clear motive, fueled by greed and betrayal, presenting evidence that suggested Todd had been both the mastermind and accomplice in the violent confrontation that had ultimately led to Keith's death. Witnesses took the stand, including Greg, who begrudgingly recounted the unraveling relationship between Todd and Keith. The courtroom held its breath as he described the conversations he'd overheard, fueled by anger and resentment over business decisions gone awry. Todd felt cornered. Greg testified, voice trembling. He just kept talking about how to handle the situation, how Keith wouldn't let up. The defense countered with an aggressive strategy, painting Todd as a victim of circumstances. They presented character witnesses, each trying to portray him as a devoted family man who had never wished harm upon anyone. Todd sat rigidly, eyes flickering between fear and defiance, as he listened to the narrative unfold around him. Amidst the tension, Laura sat with arms crossed, recalling the long days and sleepless nights devoted to untangling the web of deceit surrounding the case. As the trial unfolded, she reflected on its impact on the community. It had sent shockwaves through the tight-knit town, fracturing trust and exposing hidden fractures that had silently festered. The climax of the trial arrived with the final testimony from Julia Wilkins. Veiled in sorrow, yet fueled by an unwavering resolve for justice. Battling through tears, she described not only her husband's love, but also the life they had built together, now shattered by senseless violence. As she recounted the warning she received that fateful night, a pin-drop silence enveloped the courtroom, punctuated only by the quiet sounds of muffled sobs. As the jury deliberated, Laura felt a sense of urgency, the weight of the community's hopes resting on their shoulders. Hours turned into an eternity as she paced in the hallway, the once familiar corridors filled with anxious energy, turning unfamiliar and tense. Finally, the courtroom doors swung open, and the jury returned with their verdict. The murmurs quieted to a hush that felt charged with electric anticipation. The foreman looked solemn as he addressed the judge, eyes scanning the room before delivering the decision. Laura held her breath, anxiously gripping the edge of the wooden bench. "Guilty of second-degree murder?" the foreman declared. The sound of gasps rippled through the courtroom, a mix of relief and disbelief. Julia Wilkins clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. A cathartic release enveloped the tension that had gripped Sycamore Creek for so long. But for the Wilkins family, the verdict was a small but significant step toward healing. Yet as they left the courtroom, haunted by loss but armed with justice, Laura couldn't help but wonder how this chapter would resonate throughout the town. In a place that had once felt so safe, scars would linger long after the gavel had fallen, reminding those who remained that even in a quiet town, darkness could creep in and upend lives in an instant. The aftermath. In the weeks following Todd Marston's conviction, life in Sycamore Creek began to find its rhythm again. Yet a fragile unease loomed over the town. The gavel's echo still reverberated in the halls of local schools and businesses, serving as a constant reminder that beneath the placid surface, danger had lurked closer than anyone had imagined. For the residents, the trial had unearthed not only the harsh realities of betrayal and violence, but also the threads binding them together, now frayed and vulnerable. Detective Laura Marsh found herself grappling with her own feelings in the aftermath. Returning to the precinct, she hung her coat and settled at her desk, the weight of the case still heavy on her shoulder. She had sought justice for Keith and his family, but a sense of unease persistently gnawed at her. She was satisfied with the outcome of the trial, yet questions lingered. Had they truly uncovered everything? Were there more shadows hiding behind familiar faces? Julia Wilkins often visited the precinct, working tirelessly to rebuild her family's life in the wake of the tragedy. She carried herself with newfound strength, a fierce determination ignited by her loss. One afternoon, she approached Laura with gratitude and a quiet resolve, sharing her commitment to advocate for victims' rights in the community. "I can't let Keith's memory fade away unrecognized. There's so much to do." Laura was moved by Julia's resilience. It inspired her in turn. Together, they began planning a series of community outreach programs focused on prevention and awareness, aiming to ensure that other families did not face such darkness alone. Laura's heart swelled with hope. She could finally channel the tumult of the case into something positive. Yet as the seasons changed, so did the mood of Sycamore Creek. Whispers lingered, suspicions brewed, and some families chose to shutter their doors a little tighter, reluctance casting a shadow over their interactions. The notion that evil could exist in their midst was a bitter pill to swallow, one that sparked divides within their once unbreakable bonds. Laura found solace in her work, responding diligently to calls and assisting community members in distress. She also dedicated time to mentoring newer officers, emphasizing that their duty was not just to enforce the law, but to connect with the community. A lesson learned through the case that exploring the layers beneath the surface was vital for a safe environment. As time wore on, the pain of loss continued to echo within the community. But so too did the resilience born from shared tribulations. With Julia leading the way, Sycamore Creek began to hold events honoring Keith's memory, fundraisers to support victims and their families, encouraging an open dialogue about safety and communication. The town learned the importance of vigilance, not only in safeguarding themselves, but in caring for one another. As Laura drove through the streets of Sycamore Creek, the sun dipping toward the horizon, she caught sight of a new mural painted on the community center's wall, an oversized depiction of intertwined hands, representing unity and strength in the face of adversity. The artwork was a hopeful symbol of resilience, echoing the commitment between friends and neighbors to rebuild what had been fractured, to honor those who had been lost, and to vow that the shadows that once lingered would be kept at bay. While the scars of the past would never fully disappear, every day brought with it a promise, a whisper of renewal. Laura smiled softly at the thought the heart of Sycamore Creek continued to beat, resilient and determined, as it braved the future together. Reflection. As the chill of winter settled over Sycamore Creek, Laura Marsh found moments of quiet reflection in the stillness that came after the storm. Evening walks through the town felt different now. Each neighbor acknowledged her with a nod, a silent understanding shared in their eyes. They had witnessed a fracture and found a way to mend it. Sitting at her kitchen table one night, Laura thumbed through her case files, finding solace in the non-familiarity of the paper, the notes, the photographs. The evidence, it all represented a journey of introspection and growth. She thought about Keith Wilkins, a life interrupted, and how the echoes of his story had sparked change, not only in the community, but also within her. Laura had entered this case as a searcher of truth, but emerged as something more, a nurturer of connection. Beyond the investigative pursuit, she recognized the essence of human experience, the vulnerability tied to love, loss, and resilience. As her fond memories of those she lost mingled with the strides made toward healing, she vowed to carry their stories forward.